The first storytelling mistake that a pro director never makes is a character without a clear want. And while it may be easier to write a passive character because there's not as much work involved, there's no benefit to spending 90 minutes watching someone on screen who doesn't want anything. Be sure that your character is always pushing towards their ultimate desire. What that ultimate desire is up to you, but it needs to be a representation of who the character is at their core. For example, if the protagonist is a race car driver who loves his family, his ultimate desire will most likely have something to do with racing, family values, and probably money. In contrast, it might be a tougher sell to an audience if his ultimate desire is to be an accountant for a local government. Although there's probably a way to turn that into a cool movie, but you get my point. A character's desire should be a logical and emotional extension of who they are, and they should want it with all their heart. Otherwise, we won't care. The second storytelling mistake is playing it safe. No matter what kind of film you're making, the story should push the protagonist to the max. Now, that doesn't mean that every film should end with a climactic battle for the fate of planet Earth, but at the end of the story, the character should be put through hell, whether they're fighting an alien race or just trying to get the girl. So when you're writing conflict, imagine the most difficult challenge that your character could endure, given their situation. And after you've discovered that, go 2 to 3 levels deeper, because I guarantee there's always a greater obstacle. Things can always be worse. I know that conflict can be difficult to write because the average person is wired to avoid conflict in their daily life. So intentionally creating obstacle after obstacle for your characters can feel a little bit uncomfortable at first. This is something that I've personally struggled with when writing stories, but I had to remember that characters aren't people. And while the conflict you write for your characters may feel personal because it's often kind of stemming from personal experience, it's just a story, it's not real. You have to kind of put on a separate hat when you're creating obstacles for imaginary characters. Playing it safe with conflict is rarely a good idea. You have to push your character to their absolute limits, because without conflict, the audience will be bored. Having a bored audience is one of the gravest sins in filmmaking. The next storytelling mistake that a pro filmmaker never makes is including a scene that doesn't progress the story. What does this mean exactly? Stories are fractal. Just like a film should take a character on a journey from beginning to end, you can also apply this principle to a scene itself. Each scene has a beginning, middle, and an end the same way an act does, the same way an entire story does. And you have to look at scenes that way as well. Each scene should give the audience new information that it didn't have in the beginning of the scene. And that information should tie to the scene that preceded it and to the scene that's coming up next. Which means that every scene should be its own linchpin, meaning if you removed any scene from the edit, then it breaks the story. And this applies to every single scene in your film, whether it's a character introduction, whether it's a conversation, or whether it's an action sequence with 0 dialogue. And this is very difficult, by the way, but it's rewarding. The fourth storytelling mistake, and this might be controversial to some, but relying too much on words when visual elements could probably tell the story better. When you're telling a story, you need to consider the best ways to progress the story in any given situation, because it's not always obvious. And despite the fact that film contains a lot of dialogue, screenplays are mostly words at the end of the day, film is first and foremost a visual medium. And audiences derive more information from visual cues like facial expression, body language, shot composition, lighting, than they ever do from just words alone. So in my opinion, a pro filmmaker should always aim to tell the story as visually as possible. Now that doesn't mean you can't use dialogue. Obviously use dialogue, but the dialogue should either be used to progress the story, reveal character, or create tension as a way to enhance the already present visual storytelling. If there's something that you want the character to say, try first to express it visually. Again, this is usually a more difficult way to tell a story up front, but when you get it right, you'll be able to say more with less. Out of all the mistakes on this list, this is probably the most subtle and most overlooked, but it's a pet peeve of mine, and it's probably a pet peeve of your audience, and that is an idiot plot. According to Wikipedia, an idiot plot is a story which is kept in motion solely by virtue of the fact that everybody involved is an idiot and where the story would quickly end or possibly not even happen if this were not the case. Having said that, there are plenty of cases in which an idiot plot is perfect. Comedies, farces, tales of mistaken identity. But where it doesn't work, in my opinion, is when it's a result of lazy or low-resolution writing, meaning that if the writer had just thought a little bit more about the scene, considered it from a couple more angles, they would have figured out a smarter way to progress the story. The reason this frustrates an audience is because it takes them out of the movie. They start thinking, wait, why did he do XYZ? Or, well, if I was doing that, I would just have done XYZ and it would have stopped that whole thing from happening. You don't want the audience to be thinking during the story, at least in my opinion. I think the audience should think as little as possible, but the audience should feel as much as possible. So to avoid this mistake, focus on how you can make the audience feel. This doesn't mean that all your characters have to be super geniuses, but the choices your characters make should reflect human nature as well as each character's individual incentive structure. So if a character of yours is actually an idiot and makes a dumb choice, it should make sense within the context of the story and not be a flaw in the way the story is told. The next storytelling mistake is one that has the power to spoil your entire film. And I'm talking about a lack of point of view. And how it can spoil your entire film is that there's nothing that dulls a film's impact like when you're unclear about who the audience should focus on. In my opinion, it shows a lack of craft, so let me make it clear. The film should be structured from the point of view of the protagonist unless it serves the story to do otherwise from time to time. And even if you have multiple plots or a large cast of characters, it's rare that there isn't a primary source of focus. And a pro filmmaker always knows what they're focusing on at any given point in the story. And if you're dead set on having multiple protagonists, then each protagonist should represent something unique to the controlling idea or theme of the film. Because if the main characters are too alike, then the audience is going to get confused. So if you find yourself in that situation, it's best to either cut a character or combine them into one. Beyond that, here are some basic suggestions for a way to enhance your understanding of point of view within a story. When crafting a scene, know what each character wants and determine who is going to win or lose by the end of it. That will inform whose point of view that we should focus on as an audience, and then just do this for every single scene in your film. And you will eventually craft a ever-expanding and threading of point of view throughout the scene, and your audience will love your film and you'll be the greatest filmmaker of all time. Storytelling mistake number 7 is forgetting how an audience will view the story the first time that they watch it. A pro filmmaker is aware that the story they've worked on for thousands of hours will one day be seen by an audience for the first time, and that audience will have little to no context about what to expect. For example, the subtleties of an acting choice, a slight eyebrow raise, a micro expression, a slight shift in tonality might look huge to you because you've watched it 1,000 times. But that micro expression will go unnoticed to an audience member during a first viewing because there's so much information that's bombarding them that they probably won't pick up on everything. And speaking of first viewing, that's probably all you're going to get for the majority of your audience. Most people don't watch movies more than once, so you must reward an audience at different levels, whether they're watching it for the first time or the 10th. If you've been super focused on a story for a long period of time, it's always helpful to take an extended break from it. I'm doing that right now. I just finished the assembly cut of my debut feature film. I haven't watched it in like a week because I want to come at it with fresh eyes. That way, this will allow you to reassess the story like a first-time viewer, and I guarantee you'll be surprised by what you notice and what you don't. Now we come to the final storytelling mistake that pro directors never make. This is something that can be avoided in many different situations, but it always applies to every directing choice that you make, and that is maintaining the controlling idea or theme, whichever you want to call it. There's tons of literature on the idea of what a theme is, and I'm not going to go into that. So for instance, let's use a cliche. Crime doesn't pay. That's a cliche controlling idea. So if that's your theme, then every element of your story should map towards that statement. And while that phrase should never be directly spoken by a character, all actions, behaviors, dialogue, and story beats should lead your audience to arrive at that statement themselves through implied meaning. Of course, there are exceptions. A film doesn't always have to have a razor-sharp message. Some would say that lends itself to being more of a piece of propaganda than a piece of art. At some level, the filmmaker has to know what they're trying to say. Otherwise, there's no ideas to communicate with the audience. And why would an audience want to watch a film with no meaning? A heuristic that I use is known as a theme filter. I learned this in film school. Any idea that I have gets run through the theme filter, and if it passes through, then it becomes a potential choice. That way, all my potential choices are at the very least in alignment with what I'm trying to say with this film. I hope you've enjoyed this video about storytelling mistakes that pro directors never make. This is the first video I've made on this subject, so I'd love to hear from you what I got right, what I got wrong, what you'd like to see more of. This is a relatively new channel, so I'm trying to learn. This is a two-way conversation. You know, it's not just me making videos into the void. So, but seriously, thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.